There's some really good momentum from governments, from cities, from businesses, from investors, and there's some bullshit. But you have to be sophisticated to distinguish between the two and not just label everything as nonsense. Otherwise, it's very difficult to make progress, and actually your voice won't be heard if you're non-discriminatory like that.
My name is Philippa Nuttall, Environment Editor at the New Statesman. Today I'm speaking to Nigel Topping, who is the high-level climate action champion from the UK. Hi Nigel, thanks for joining us today. To start with, could you explain to us what is a climate action champion?
A high-level climate action champion.
A high-level climate action, sorry.
The role was created as part of the Paris Agreement, which is an agreement between countries in recognition of the reality that it's going to take everybody to tackle the climate crisis. The role is to work with what the multilateral system calls non-state actors, so businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, and everyone else, but they're the ones with the real sort of economic and regulatory power between them to actually implement change.
Yeah.
And it's quite a clear mandate is to drive ambition and action from those non-state actors in support of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So mitigation, resilience, finance.
And you were previously CEO of We Mean Business, and your background is in the private industry. We're hearing lots of ambitious pledges from governments here. How ambitious is business being in terms of moving towards net zero?
Well, I think a bit like governments, you've got some governments really ambitious, some lagging. But we're the same in the private sector, of course. It's not consistent. But we are seeing real leadership from the private sector that I think was unthinkable a couple of years ago. You know, we're seeing a massive step up from the finance sector to commit to financing the transition to net zero. The proof will be in the pudding when the detailed plans and the actual capital flows. But we all tend to commit first, then act later. There's always a lag. And then across business and industry, we're starting to reach a critical mass in almost every sector of major players saying we're in the race to zero. We're committed to the short-term actions necessary to get to a halving of emissions by 2030. I think we're seeing that what we call that ambition loop playing out almost in real time here. As you have a government announcement, and then a private sector announcement, and then another government announcement, and then the mix. Of course, you've got finance, just to finance it all, and some of the other cities and regions who are often forgotten in the state context. But over 1,000 cities in the race to zero, and Nicola Sturgeon and Governor Newsom of California and others leading the coalition of states and regions to commit to net zero as well. So.
And in that sense, from what you said, do businesses in general now see movement towards net zero climate action as an opportunity rather than a cost, or is there still an overall tendency to see it as a cost?
I think first of all they see it as an inevitability, right? And then of course a big disruptive transition brings risks and opportunities. But I think that's what's really changed in the last 12 months, is that now it's seen as inevitability. We'll see placards today in the demonstrations saying systems change, not climate change. We're starting to see systems change. That includes youth activists on the street, but it also includes regulators, city mayors, investors, banks, technologists, and supply side and demand side signals. When all of those are pointing to the same direction, you're kind of mad as a CEO not to read that. It's not. You don't have to be a soothsayer to see that direction now. It's screaming at you from all sides. But within that, there is risk and opportunity. And
when we talk about systems change, does this mean the downfall of the capitalist system, or are we talking about a different form of capitalism?
I think we're talking about a different form of capitalism. I haven't seen anyone actually with an intelligent suggestion for an overthrow of the capitalist system and an alternative. We know that it's very good at certain things, and it's up to society to decide what the goals are. And I tend to think that we're leaving a period of kind of unfettered greed and slightly myopic belief in the power of capitalism and trickle-down economics, and we're realising actually society can decide that what we want is a planet, an economy that operates within planetary boundaries and that is more distributive. And that I think is going to be the key thing for the second week. I think real momentum about the technological transition. What about the human transition and addressing some of the huge inequities which climate change really throws into focus.
Yesterday, Greta Thunberg, there were protests in Edinburgh from Fridays for Future, and Greta Thunberg said this was no longer a climate meeting, it was a corporate greenwashing festival. So in terms of business, what you've said is all very laudable, but how do we actually measure that? Does there need to be an outside body to actually show that change is really happening and it's not just greenwashing?
Ooh, outside body called government? That's government's job. So Rishi Sunak announcing that every listed company in the UK will have to publish a net zero transition plan. I started my work in this field with the Carbon Disclosure Project, which was founded in 2001 to drive transparency from corporations. And 20 years later, that's becoming regulation through TCFD and through the kind of transition plan disclosure that Rishi Sunak talked about. So there is greenwash, but to just label everything at greenwash is simply not true. You have to be a bit more forensic than that, because otherwise you end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So there's some really good momentum from governments, from cities, from businesses, from investors, and there's some bullshit. But you have to be sophisticated to distinguish between the two and not just label everything as nonsense. Otherwise, it's very difficult to make progress, and actually your voice won't be heard if you're non-discriminatory like that.
And in terms of government regulation, that's part of the issue, but obviously climate change is happening. You said yesterday in a session that we need to be faster, that it's still not going fast enough. So do we also need a different body that's not government to actually make sure that what's happening is in line with science, is in line with the IPCC report, for example?
If you listen to the CEO or the chair of the Climate Change Committee holding the UK government to account, they don't pull any punches. They're very clear about when the UK government is implementing policies in line with their recommendations and the pathway to 1.5 degree of net zero by 2050, and when they're not. And interestingly, we've seen more and more countries look to that model and maybe tweak it to their own circumstances. So I think self-policing is always dangerous, right? Because you can't be poacher and gamekeeper. You do need a sort of separation of power. So I think, the scientific community have been brilliant at explaining just how serious the crisis is and what we really need to do. And I think governments need people outside to hold them to account. Businesses need people from outside to hold them to account. This is not about voluntarism. I mean, everybody needs somebody to keep them honest.
And so in terms of what's happening in COP this week that's just gone and next week, what needs to happen to speed up the transition from the private sector?
I think that we've often taken a rather defensive stance to it, affected by some very negative lobbying by some interest groups who said, we can't do this, it's going to destroy jobs, it's going to destroy economies. We know that's not true. It's all about jobs, it's all about the economy, it's all about driving healthier, more prosperous societies. So the first thing I think is to have the self-confidence to set goals that we don't know all the answers to. So I think a bit more imagination and boldness in the goal, setting goals that get us to where we need to get to, rather than where we think we might be able to get to. Second of all, then making sure that the policy aligns with those goals and reflects the different dynamics of different sectors at different times. So just to be specific, renewable power now cheaper than hydrocarbon-based power almost everywhere in the world. So that's just about scaling up. So setting the kind of really bold targets like net zero grids in 2035, coal phase out dates. Just get on with that, because the economics is there, markets can handle that with blitzing. Electric vehicles a little bit behind. They're not quite at cost parity yet. So for the next few years, a bit of fiscal support to make it easier for people to buy the cars, which keep the costs coming down. So when it's really mature, just scale up. Where it's on the brink, help it get to the point where markets will just take over. And then we've got less mature technologies like green hydrogen, green steel, green shipping fuel, which need take-off agreements, early stage R&D support, infrastructure support. So different regulations are needed for different sectors at different phases of the transition.
And obviously what's happening is happening very much in the developed world, but obviously this also needs to happen in the developing world, and they also need to be able to develop. I mean, India is a good case in point. Yeah. So how do we make sure that countries go to EVs when, most of their car markets, especially, for example, are second-hand cars from the Western world at the moment?
First thing I think is we should be careful not to fall into an old trap of assuming that all technological transitions have to happen 20 years later in emerging and developing economies. Mobile money and mobile banking in Kenya is more sophisticated than here in the UK or in Manhattan. And in Kenya, for example, they've already got a very clear rule about the import of second-hand vehicles having to be to a minimum standard, so they couldn't be 20-year-old vehicles. They might be 5 or 10-year-old. I forget the exact details, but so the Kenyans are already thinking about that. That sort of thing needs to become. When I was in Barbados, I think they're planning a rule which would ban all imports of combustion engine vehicles at the same time as they ban sales, so that from that point on, the only new vehicle, even the second-hand vehicles, would have to be electric. But yeah, I think as we start to really believe that these transitions are taking place, we really need to think through some of the unintended consequences, because there's always unintended consequences with big transitions.
Sure.
Think through them and put in place the guardrails to make sure they don't come true.
And just one very final question. The missing bit of the jigsaw seems to be behavioural change. So we've talked about technology, we've talked about businesses, governments. We're not going to be able to, you mentioned sustainable aviation fuel, but we won't be able to keep on flying necessarily in the same way as we do now. What role does private industry need to play in terms of behavioural change?
Again, I think it varies sector by sector. I mean, aviation is really interesting. The international arrangements through the International Civilization, ICAO. ICAO says has got a goal currently, formally, multilaterally, of 50% reductions by 2050. We know that's nothing like enough for the science. Interesting, IATA just a couple of weeks ago, so the trade body came out and said we're committed to net zero. So I would expect ICAO to catch up with the science and with industry. That's an example where industry is definitely ahead. And a lot of those, like John Holland-Kay, the CEO of Heathrow's office, people need to pay more for flying. Right, I mean, this is a classic example where the externality is not being priced in. In other areas, I think we're seeing the behavioural change happening before our eyes. I mean, dietary shifts. McDonald's launching a plant burger, Sainsbury's putting alternative meats in the meat aisle. So it's not like if you're a kind of strange alternative meat person, go to the corner for your special collection. It's like mainstreaming, help choice edit the consumer. So that it just becomes normal over time. So that's part of the reason we're seeing a rapid shift towards more plant-based, which we know is better for our health as well as better for planetary health.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Nigel. It was really a pleasure to speak to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Philippa. Pleasure's mine.
If you enjoyed listening to what Nigel had to say and want to hear more interviews from The New Statesman, please go to thenewstatesman.com website or subscribe to our YouTube channel.